The cold was a living thing in the old house. It wasn't just an absence of heat, it was a presence, a weight that settled deep in the bones and stayed there. It crept through the cracks in the window frames, seeped up through the floorboards, and breathed its icy breath down the back of Ilara's neck. She was 16, but she felt ancient, worn down by the constant, grinding pressure of a life that had offered her very little warmth. Her world had shrunk to the four crumbling walls of this house and the frail, rattling breaths of her grandmother in the next room. Every morning began not with an alarm clock, but with the sound of a deep, wet cough from down the hall, a sound that sent a familiar spike of fear through Ilara's heart. It was the sound of time running out. The house itself was a monument to decay. Wallpaper, once a cheerful pattern of yellow roses, now sagged in damp, discolored sheets, peeling away to reveal the dark, water-stained plaster beneath. A bucket sat permanently in the corner of the living room, collecting the steady drip, drip, drip from the ceiling every time it rained. The sound was a constant, maddening metronome, counting down the days until they had nothing left. Bills were stacked on the kitchen counter, a leaning tower of final notices and angry red letters. They were a silent, screaming chorus of their failure. Ilara would sometimes stand and stare at them, the numbers swimming before her eyes, feeling a wave of nausea. How could so little money feel like an impassable mountain? How could the world be so vast and yet offer no foothold? Her only armor against this crushing reality was a jacket. It was an old, black leather motorcycle jacket, far too big for her slender frame. The leather was cracked and worn thin in places, scarred with the history of a life lived before hers. It smelled of old leather, motor oil, and faintly, of the rain-soaked asphalt of 1,000 forgotten highways. It had been her father's. He was a ghost, a collection of faded photographs and stories her grandmother told on good days. A man with a wide smile and kind eyes who had ridden away one morning and never come back. An accident, they'd said. A patch of black ice on a cold November road. He'd left behind a grieving mother, a heartbroken wife who soon followed him, and a daughter who only knew him through the heavy, comforting weight of his jacket. She wore it everywhere. It was her shield at school, where the other kids saw only her worn-out jeans and second-hand shoes. Their whispers and cruel jokes were like stones thrown against a fortress wall when she had the jacket on. The thick leather seemed to absorb the blows, keeping her own fragile heart from shattering. It was her uniform at her after-school job at the Greasy Spoon, a diner on the edge of town where she washed dishes until her hands were raw, the smell of grease clinging to her for hours. The diner was its own special kind of purgatory. The fluorescent lights hummed a dreary tune, casting a sickly yellow glow on the cracked vinyl booths and sticky countertops. But it was money. It was a few dollars to put towards the electric bill, a few dollars for her grandmother's medicine. It was never enough, but it was something. It was the best she could do. The greatest threat, however, was not the cold or the bills or the bullies. The greatest threat wore a cheap suit and a perpetually smug expression. His name was Mr. Albright, the principal of her high school. He saw Ilara not as a student, but as a problem to be managed. A liability. He would call her into his office, a sterile room that smelled of floor polish and disappointment. He would sit behind his large, empty desk, tapping a pen on a file with her name on it. He spoke of her slipping grades, her occasional absences. He used words like truancy and neglect. He never asked why she was tired, why she sometimes missed a day. He didn't care about the nights she spent awake, listening to her grandmother's labored breathing, or the hours she spent scrubbing pots and pans for minimum wage. The school has a responsibility, Ilara, he had said just last week, his voice smooth and cold as a river stone. A responsibility to ensure our students are in a suitable home environment. If your grades don't improve, if your attendance doesn't become perfect, I'll have no choice but to make a call. Social services will have to be involved. For your own good, of course, for her own good. The words had echoed in her head, a venomous whisper. He would take her away from the only family she had left. He would put her grandmother in a state-run home, a place people went to be forgotten. He held their entire world in his manicured hands, and he was threatening to crush it. The fear was a constant, bitter taste in the back of her throat. It was a Tuesday afternoon, colder than the last. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, spitting a miserable, sleeting rain. Elara was walking home from the diner, her shift over. Her feet were wet, her muscles ached, and the meager cash in her pocket felt impossibly light. She pulled her father's jacket tighter around herself, the collar turned up against the biting wind. That's when she heard it. A low, guttural rumble that grew into a deafening roar. It was the sound of thunder on a clear day, a sound that didn't belong on this quiet, forgotten street. A line of motorcycles, chrome and black steel, pulled into the diner's parking lot. They moved like a pack of wolves, sleek and dangerous. There were about a dozen of them. Big men, clad in leather vests adorned with patches and insignias. Their faces were hard, weathered by wind and sun. They swung their legs off their bikes with a practiced ease, their heavy boots crunching on the wet gravel. Their laughter was loud and rough, cutting through the dreary afternoon air. Elara froze. This was a different kind of threat. Not the insidious, bureaucratic cruelty of Principal Albright, but something more primal, more immediate. She lowered her head, hoping to become invisible, and tried to hurry past the edge of the parking lot. It didn't work. "Well, look what we have here," one of them called out, a smirk on his face. He was huge, with a braided beard that reached his chest. "Little girl playing biker," another one laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "That jacket's about to swallow you whole, kid," their words struck her, sharp and humiliating. Her face burned with a hot flush of shame. Her armor, her one source of strength, was now the source of their ridicule. She clutched the worn leather of the sleeves, her knuckles white. She kept her eyes fixed on the cracked pavement in front of her, trying to will herself away, to simply disappear. "Don't cry. Don't you dare cry." She risked a glance up. The men were watching her, their expressions a mixture of amusement and casual cruelty. All except one. He stood near the front of the group, leaning against a massive, gleaming black bike. He was older than the others, his long hair and beard more gray than black. His eyes, set in a face that looked like it had been carved from granite, were narrowed, not with amusement, but with an intense, focused curiosity. As she drew level with the group, trying to give them a wide berth, he pushed himself off his bike. He took a slow step forward. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. She braced herself for another insult, another laugh at her expense. But he didn't laugh. He just looked at her jacket. His gaze was fixed on the right sleeve, just below the shoulder. The laughter from the other bikers faltered, dying out as they noticed their leader's sudden stillness. The air grew thick with a new kind of tension. The man, who the others called Bear, raised a hand, not to strike, but to point. His finger, thick as a sausage, hovered in the air a few inches from her arm. "That patch," he said. His voice wasn't a shout, but a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in Elara's very bones. It silenced everything. The wind, the distant traffic, the frantic beating of her own heart. "Where did you get this jacket?" Elara followed his gaze. He was pointing at a small, circular patch sewn into the leather. It was faded, the threads worn, but the image was still clear, a stylized eagle with a lightning bolt in its talons, encircled by a motto she had never been able to read. It was just part of the jacket, part of her father. She had never given it any thought. She swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. "It was my father's," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Bear took another step closer, his eyes never leaving the patch. The other bikers were off their bikes now, forming a silent, watchful circle. The playful mockery was gone, replaced by something somber, almost reverent. "Your father," Bear repeated, his voice softer now, but laced with an urgency that frightened her. "What was his name?" "David," she said, her voice trembling slightly. David Jensen. A collective intake of breath seemed to pass through the group of men. Bear's stony expression cracked, a flicker of disbelief and profound sadness crossing his features. He looked from the patch to her face, really seeing her for the first time. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the worry etched around her mouth. He saw the defiant set of her jaw. Davy Ghost Jensen, another biker murmured from the back, the name spoken like a prayer. Bear nodded slowly, his eyes locking with Alara's. Ghost, he confirmed. He rode with us. Before everything. He was our brother. He reached out, his calloused hand gently touching the sleeve of the jacket, his fingers tracing the outline of the eagle. This patch, this is from the unit. We all served together. Alara stared at him, bewildered. These loud, intimidating men, they knew her father. They were his friends. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The jacket suddenly felt heavier, imbued with a history she had never understood. Bear's gaze softened. What's going on, kid? You look like you're carrying the world on your shoulders, and for the first time in a long time, faced with an unexpected and incomprehensible kindness, Alara felt her defenses crumble. The tears she had been holding back for so long finally came, silent and hot, tracing paths down her cold cheeks. She didn't sob, but the tears flowed freely, a release of all the pent-up fear and loneliness. The bikers stood awkwardly, their bravado gone, replaced by a shared, uncomfortable sorrow. Bear gestured to one of the diner's outdoor tables. Come on. Sit down. Talk to us. Hesitantly, she sat. And she talked. The story came spilling out of her, the cold house, the leaking roof, her grandmother's cough that never seemed to get better. She told them about the stack of unpaid bills, the constant hunger, and the gnawing fear of the eviction notice she knew was coming any day. Finally, her voice dropping to a near whisper, she told them about Principal Albright and his threats, the cold, calculating way he held her future, and her grandmother's future, in his hands. As she spoke, she watched the faces of the men around her change. The hardness returned, but it was different now. It was not directed at her. It was a cold, simmering anger, a protective fury that settled in their eyes. When she finished, a heavy silence fell over the parking lot. Bear leaned forward, his elbows on the table. Your father, he said, his voice thick with emotion, saved my life. We were pinned down. He pulled me out. Took a bullet that was meant for me. He was the best man I ever knew. He paused, looking around at the solemn faces of his companions. He made us all swear an oath. That if anything ever happened to him, we'd look out for his family. We lost track, after. It's no excuse. We failed him. He stood up, his decision made. We're not failing him again. He pulled out a thick wallet and slapped several $100 bills on the table. Go inside. Get yourself and your grandma the biggest, warmest meal they've got. Get groceries. Get whatever you need for tonight. He then turned to her and asked for her address. She gave it to him, writing it down on a napkin with a shaky hand. Stay strong, Alara, he said, using her name for the first time. Help is coming. Then, as quickly as they had arrived, they were gone. The roar of their engines filled the air for a moment and then faded into the distance, leaving Alara alone in the gray afternoon, the money on the table looking unreal. A tiny, fragile seed of hope had been planted in the barren soil of her heart. But days turned into a week. Then 2. The money they had given her was a temporary reprieve, a small dam against a raging flood. It was gone all too quickly, spent on medicine, overdue utility bills, and food. The cold returned to the house. The drip from the ceiling continued its relentless rhythm. The hope began to wither. She felt foolish. Of course they weren't coming back. They were bikers, drifters. They had probably forgotten her the moment they hit the highway. It was a fleeting moment of pity, nothing more. The world was just as cold and unforgiving as it had always been. The final blow came on a Friday. The official eviction notice was posted on their door, the stark white paper a death sentence for their home. They had 72 hours. 3 days to pack up a lifetime of memories and go, where? A shelter? The street? That same afternoon, Principal Albright called her into his office. He had heard about the eviction. The town was small, news traveled fast. He didn't offer sympathy. He saw it as a victory. It seems the situation has resolved itself, he said, a thin, cruel smile playing on his lips. Social services will be alerted Monday morning. They'll find a more stable environment for you. It's for the best. Elara just stared at him, her body numb. The last ember of her hope was extinguished, leaving nothing but cold, black ash. She walked home in a daze, the world a blurry, meaningless smear. Her father's jacket felt impossibly heavy, no longer a shield, but a dead weight. She spent Saturday in a fog of despair, mechanically packing her few belongings into a cardboard box. Her grandmother lay in bed, too weak and dispirited to help, her quiet weeping the only sound in the house. This was it. This was the end of the line. Sunday morning dawned gray and hopeless. Elara sat on the front porch steps, the cold of the concrete seeping through her jeans. She stared at the quiet, empty street, waiting for an end she couldn't yet imagine. And then she heard it. It started as a faint vibration, a tremor she felt more in her teeth than in her ears. A low, distant hum that grew steadily louder, deeper. It wasn't the sound of a few motorcycles this time. This was something else entirely. This was the sound of an approaching army. The hum grew into a rumble, the rumble into a roar. The windows of her house began to rattle in their frames. The ground beneath her feet started to shake. Down the street, a dog started barking frantically. Curtains twitched in the windows of the neighboring houses as people peered out, their faces filled with confusion and alarm. Then they appeared. They came over the crest of the hill, a tidal wave of chrome and steel. It wasn't a dozen bikes. It was 50. 100. More. They filled the street from curb to curb, a rolling river of metal that seemed to have no end. The roar was deafening now, a physical force that pressed in on her, shaking the very air she breathed. They were a legion. Bikers from chapters all across the state, their vests bearing patches from cities she had never even heard of. They moved with a disciplined, almost military precision, fanning out and parking in neat rows, lining both sides of the street for blocks. The sound of hundreds of powerful engines being cut one by one was replaced by a sudden, profound silence. Doors up and down the street slammed shut. A few neighbors who had been outside scurried back into their homes, locking the doors behind them. 2 police cars arrived, their lights flashing, but they stopped at the edge of the assembled army, the 2 officers inside looking small and utterly overwhelmed. Out of the sea of black leather, one man walked forward. It was Bear. He moved with a calm authority, the crowd of bikers parting before him like the Red Sea. He stopped at the bottom of her porch steps and looked up at her, his expression grim but kind. "Sorry we're late," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble. Took a while to round everyone up. Elara could only stare, speechless. This couldn't be real. It was a dream, a hallucination brought on by despair. "Your father was family," Bear continued, his voice rising so all could hear. "And this family pays its debts. No daughter of Davy Ghost Jensen will ever be left cold or alone." He gave a sharp nod. And the army moved. It was the most organized chaos Elara had ever seen. A group of men swarmed her house, but they weren't there to cause harm. They were carrying toolboxes, ladders, and lumber. A large flatbed truck pulled up, loaded with shingles and sheets of drywall. The sound of hammers on nails began to ring through the quiet morning air. They were fixing the roof. Another group, led by a man with a plumber's union patch on his vest, descended into the basement. A different team started tearing out the stained, peeling wallpaper. A truck from a local appliance store arrived, delivering a new furnace and a water heater. A woman with kind eyes and tattooed arms gently led Alara's grandmother out to a comfortable chair they'd set up on the lawn, wrapping her in a warm blanket and handing her a cup of hot tea. She was a nurse, a member of another chapter's auxiliary. Bear walked up the steps and handed Alara a thick envelope. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was the deed to her house. Stamped across it in bold red ink were the words, "Paid in full." Beneath it was a cashier's check made out to her name for an amount that made her gasp. It was more money than she had ever imagined seeing in her life. "That's for you and your grandma," Bear said gruffly. "For bills, for food, for school. For a future. It's from all of us. From your father's family." Tears streamed down Alara's face once more, but this time they were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of overwhelming, unbelievable gratitude. But they weren't finished. "There's one more piece of business," Bear said, his eyes hardening. He turned and gestured to a group of about 30 bikers who had remained by their machines. "Let's go for a ride." They mounted their bikes, and with a coordinated roar, the column of riders peeled off, heading towards the center of town. Towards the high school. They didn't go onto school property. They simply parked along the street outside, a silent, intimidating wall of leather and chrome. Bear pulled out his phone and made a call. Mr. Albright, enjoying his quiet Sunday at home, answered irritably. "Who is this?" "My name isn't important," Bear said, his voice dangerously calm. "I'm calling about one of your students. Alara Jensen. I'd like you to step outside the school. We need to have a conversation." "The school is closed," Albright snapped. "And I have no intention of." "I think you'll want to make an exception," Bear interrupted, his voice dropping an octave. "We're all very interested in the well-being of a decorated war hero's daughter. And we'd hate for the school board, not to mention the press, to hear about how she's being bullied out of her home and education under your supervision." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Albright, peering out his home office window, could see the distant glint of chrome. He arrived 20 minutes later, his car slowing to a crawl as he took in the scene. His face was pale, his usual arrogance gone, replaced by a raw, naked fear. He got out of his car, his movements stiff. He was met by Bear and a dozen of the most intimidating men he had ever seen. They didn't shout. They didn't threaten. Bear simply laid out the facts. He spoke of David Jensen's service, his sacrifice, and the oath they had all sworn. He explained, in very clear and simple terms, that Alara was now under their protection. Any further issues, any hint of bullying from students or pressure from the administration, would be considered a personal insult to every man standing there, and to the hundreds more who were currently rebuilding her home. "She will be provided with tutors, if she needs them," Bear concluded, his voice like ice. "She will be given any extension she requires. She will be treated with the dignity and respect she deserves. You will ensure her path to graduation is smooth and unimpeded. Are we clear?" Mr. Albright, sweating despite the chill in the air, could only nod, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. He stammered apologies and swore he would do whatever it took. He had never looked so small. By the time the sun began to set, the house was transformed. The roof was new. The walls were patched and painted. The plumbing worked without a single drip, and for the first time in years, warm, steady heat flowed from the vents, chasing away the cold for good. The kitchen was stocked with groceries. The house was no longer a crumbling shell, it was a home. A safe, warm, secure home. The bikers worked until the last job was done. Then, as quietly and efficiently as they had arrived, they began to pack up their tools. They gathered on the street, a vast assembly of guardians. Alara, with her grandmother leaning on her arm, stood on the new, sturdy porch. She looked out at the sea of faces, men who had been strangers this morning, but who were now inextricably part of her life. She was wearing her father's jacket. It no longer felt heavy. It felt like a perfect fit. Bear walked up to her one last time. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "If you ever need anything," he said, "anything at all, you know who to call." He handed her a card with a single phone number on it. Then he turned, walked to his bike, and with a single hand signal, the engines roared to life in unison. In a great, thundering procession, the army of bikers rode away, disappearing over the hill, leaving behind a transformed house, a transformed life, and a quiet street full of stunned and newly respectful neighbors. In the years that followed, Elara thrived. She graduated high school with honors, her path smoothed by a suddenly very attentive Principal Albright. The bullies at school never bothered her again, a single glance at the patch on her jacket was enough to make them walk the other way. She went to college on a scholarship funded by a veterans association she'd never heard of, though she had her suspicions. Her grandmother lived out her days in warmth and comfort, her cough finally easing in a house free of damp and cold. Elara never forgot the day the thunder rolled into her life. She kept the jacket, her father's jacket, hanging in a place of honor. It was more than just worn leather and faded patches. It was a testament to the fact that family is not always born of blood. It is forged in loyalty, sealed by honor, and paid for with a love that time and distance can never break. It was a reminder that even in the coldest, darkest of times, a single act of bravery from long ago can echo through the years, and that sometimes, help arrives not in a quiet prayer, but in a deafening, beautiful roar.